Welcome, everybody. Just letting folks pop in. It looks like the numbers are stabilizing and we've got a ton to get through. So I think we'll just get going and dive right in. But so grateful for you all joining us today for this legislative update on climate issues as we enter the second half of the 2023 legislative session. My name is Lauren Hurl, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters. And VCV is a statewide nonprofit that advocates for strong environmental policies, holds lawmakers accountable, and helps elect pro-environment lawmakers. And I am delighted to be joined by an amazing team of advocates and coalition partners. We have a ton of content to cover today, so I'm going to be really brief. But overall, we wanted to give you all an update on the range of climate-related issues at play at the State House. House and Senate leadership have identified climate action as a top priority, and there's a number of bills moving through the process. There's also some bills that we really want to see action on and are high priorities as well. So we'll get into those. And really, this is the legislature doing its part to implement the climate action plan and to move on the policies that meet our legal and our moral obligation to act on climate and to take advantage of the economic opportunity that will benefit Vermonters by acting on climate. So we've got a number of speakers that I'll just introduce briefly as we go, just so we can keep things moving. And just for a quick rundown of how the webinar is going to go, we're going to be hearing from a number of people with some brief updates on climate policies that are moving and that are high priorities of our coalition. And then we've got a little bit more time built in for a deeper dive into the Affordable Heat Act. We just request that everybody please keep yourself on mute throughout the webinar, but please do use the chat function if you've got questions or comments. And we have some time set aside at the end so that we can get to as many of your questions as we can. And before getting into the policy overview, I did want to take a moment to introduce a new coalition partner, Kristen Warner. She's the policy manager at Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility, VBSR. And this network of businesses committed to climate action has been a really invaluable coalition partner and voice in our efforts for climate action. And Kristen has already come in and been a fabulous partner and really excited to work with her. And I just wanted to give her a chance to introduce herself briefly so you all can start getting to know her. So welcome, Kristen.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everybody. My name is Kristen Warner, and I am a longtime Vermonter. I live here in Montpelier, where I was born and raised, and I've joined VBSR as the policy manager, and I bring nearly 2 decades of organizing experience to the table. As you likely know, VBSR is a longtime Act on Climate Vermont coalition partner, bringing its mission to leverage the power of business for positive social and environmental impact. We represent over 700 members across all industries here in Vermont. VBSR's 2023 policy agenda focuses largely on calling our elected officials to take bold climate action. And we've partnered with the coalition before you today to pass the Affordable Heat Act, meaningful res reform this session, and ongoing and essential investments in building a cleaner, more accessible, multimodal transportation network. Workplace development is always going to be a central concern as a progressive business community, which is why VBSR supports strategic climate workforce investments in the Workforce and Economic Development Bill, which we'll hear about later today in the call, and policies like the Affordable Heat Act, which we'll hear more about later. And from our perspective as an organization, are fundamental to building and expanding and creating the market for a 21st century workforce that we need to develop. So I'm really pleased to be here today. This is my first webinar and my first event with this coalition, and I appreciate the warm welcome that everyone has given me and the VBSR team, and we're thrilled to work and collaborate with all of you to make Vermont a more equitable place to address the climate crisis and really start to take on some of the challenges that we face. Good to work with you all, and at this time I'll pass the mic back to you, Lauren.
Great, thanks so much, Kristen, and again, great to have you on board. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Rob Kidd from the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club to hear about some of the climate initiatives underway in the transportation space.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. For everybody's information, I'm Rob Kidd with the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club. We've been working on transportation for about 5 years now as one of our priority issues. I'm going to share actually my screen with you all because I just have a couple of short slides just to kind of explain the situation. But anyway, basically most transportation policy goes through the transportation budget, which is now known as H479. The bill is actually in the Senate now, but I just wanted to give a touchback, a replacement of what happened leading up to today. 40% of our emissions come from transportation, so it's imperative of us to transform the sector. We've had a lot of really big success with creating incentives for EVs, incentives for workplace charging and multi-unit dwelling. There's federal tax credits for EVs. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure money is providing high-speed charging at every interstate exit. And then also last year, we adopted the Advanced Clean Car and Clean Trucks programs to phase out internal combustion engines. Also, there's a really important plan going on, the carbon reduction strategy that Vermont is taking place on. So take a look at that and the climate action plan, which goes into a lot more transportation issues. But I just want to kind of throw in here, the transportation bill basically is $860 million budget. And the measures that are in it this year are not as aggressive as they were in the years past because we got a lot of the success in the EVs. But there is some good policies that are in this current version, including connecting the carbon reduction strategy planning with the climate action plan. Moving forward on complete streets policies, continuing EV incentives, continues e-bike incentive programming. But then there's also some other challenges, compromising on restoring urban transit fares, and then also creating a bike corridor along US Route 5 possibilities. But I want to show in here just some kind of possible Senate improvements because the bill kind of fell short on what's known as the mobility transportation innovation grants. So we can kind of incentivize, create more programs on that. And the Senate will be very important to do that. E-bike incentive program initially was only $100,000 for that program, and it was depleted in 6 weeks. So right now, with a combination of the Budget Adjustment Act and this bill, there's $150,000. We'd like to see more. Also, we'd like to see more long-term funding mechanisms, including exploring cap and investment programs such as TCI or even the fee-based structure. And then also we have to watch out because the administration is proposing EV mileage fees and instead of having a more detailed conversation of how we pay for transportation. So for the next couple of weeks, the House Transportation Committee will be debating the miscellaneous DMV bill. The Senate Transportation will be reviewing the budget. And I just want to flag in, the governor is opposing the transportation bill right now because of the House Ways and Means proposals for taxes. So there may be some rumbling going on from the governor, but the ideas of the climate dollars, he doesn't seem to be having a problem with. So that's my short story on the transportation issues. But before I pass it over, I just wanted to throw into two bills that I'm just roughly saying is the geothermal and ratepayer protection bills. There's been a lot of interest in those, and the bills aren't taking that much testimony yet. So we're basically asking people to contact the representatives to request that the Energy Environment Committee to hold a walkthrough of the bill and start testimony on that today, instead of waiting for next year and delaying the progress on that. So that's my short story. I'll be on. Anybody has any questions, or you can always email me at rob.kidd@sierraclub.org. And I'll pass it back to Lauren.
Thanks so much, Rob. And I'm going to turn it right over to Johanna Miller of the Vermont Natural Resources Council so we can hear about climate initiatives in the budget.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're throwing a lot at you, in part because thankfully there's a lot happening. And I'm going to talk about two important things that are happening. One, as it relates to the budget. As you probably know, the budget bill is a must-pass bill. And recently, the House spent very long days and did a lot of work to deliver the Senate an over $8 billion FY24 budget. The budget bill is now in Senate appropriations, and there are a lot of different provisions in the bill that expand investments and really critical programs, but three in particular that I wanted to highlight and that we're going to be working to make sure remain included in the budget include, first of all, really critically, a $300,000 investment to fund 3 positions required by the environmental justice law. So these are essential positions to stand up this new environmental justice policy that will be a framework for Vermont doing its work in the climate and environmental sphere. These positions have been one-time dollars, which means that the legislature has to go back and refund these positions every year. The House passed a budget that includes this investment in as a base budget investment, which is exactly what we should be doing. These are critical positions. This is a very essential policy. And it's really important that the state of Vermont, Vermonters don't have to go back every year to ask for the state to commit to what the federal, our federal obligation requires and what our moral obligation requires for us to be doing. So we need to invest in the environmental justice policy, and we need to be doing more there, but we're going to be working hard to make sure that this $300,000 for base budget support for the EJ positions remains in the budget as it continues the work in the Senate. 2 other things to highlight in the budget. There's a $3 million investment for the Clean Heat Home programs, which is to provide comprehensive weatherization and electrification services to low and moderate income Vermonters. That builds on an $8.5 million investment secured through federal funds by Senator Leahy last year. So this is really important piece as we do a lot more to reduce energy consumption and help people electrify more other heating, transport, and needs. This is a really important investment to serve low to moderate income Vermonters. And then the last thing to highlight in the budget, there is a commitment to $900,000 to support Vermont's standing up and work underway at the new state climate action office. That's really important work. It's tied to the Vermont Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan. And it's an entity now embedded in state government that will work across agencies to deliver climate progress through our state agencies. And I think to and through Vermonters. So those 3 things are critical provisions in the House passed budget. It's now in Senate appropriations, and we're going to continue to do the work that commitment remains, and we're hopeful that it will. The second important piece, Kristen sort of highlighted this in her remarks, and so glad to have Kristen on board, but is the workforce development piece to make the transition in the sort of, at the scale and pace that we need to. We obviously need to be building clean energy and climate workforce to help Vermonters make the transition. And in the workforce and economic development bill, there are 2 critical things I wanted to highlight. There's a commitment to a public education initiative to raise awareness of the career opportunities in the climate field and deliver the resources to expand things like coaching opportunities for businesses working to transition their business models in service of our climate obligations. So that's a really important commitment. And then the House also sort of delivered, almost $300,000 to really support this growing industry with a very dedicated focus. So this is a really important commitment in clean energy and climate workforce. And I think, other things that you're going to hear about later, like the Affordable Heat Act, which is, again, focused on transitioning Vermonters off of fossil fuels largely in ways that we heat. These are really designed to sort of deliver services to Vermonters and to deliver services and programs to support low to moderate income Vermonters in particular. So there's a lot there. We're going to continue to do this work, and I'm going to turn it back to Lauren.
Thank you, Joey. And now let's hear from Jonathan Dowd of Renewable Energy Vermont.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm going to share a few slides that motivate the need to reform our renewable energy standard and also say a few words about energy storage. All right, I can figure out which one of these. Here we are. So you're all probably fairly familiar with the breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. As Rob alluded to, transportation is a very big piece of that, thermal as well. When people look at electricity and see 2%, they think that we have the power sector solved, but that is really only part of the story. There are a couple of reasons behind that. One is load growth as we electrify these transportation and thermal sectors, and the other is some oddities in our renewable energy standard. So if you look at where our energy comes from a physical perspective, you will see that, pardon me here so I can advance the slide for you all. Are you still seeing the that first bar chart? Yeah, we did
Yes.
the bar chart. Yeah. All right, hang on, I'm going to reshare just a moment. Interest of expediency here, we'll go with the smaller view. Apologies for that. But our electricity comes from a lot of sources that are neither green, sustainable, or expandable. We get 17% in 2021 of our energy from the New England system mix, which is largely fossil fuels. We get a bunch from large out-of-region hydro that can't easily be expanded without causing a number of environmental issues north of the border. And our requirement for new renewables within our renewable energy standard is the worst in the region. And it is only by bringing new renewables online that we reduce our regional greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really what motivates the need to reform our renewable energy standard. What H320 would do is take our current renewable energy standard, which allows 65% of our energy to come from existing renewables, primarily large out-of-region hydro, 25% of our electricity to come from any source that's exempt from the res, and only 10% to come from new renewables, and get us to a point where we're at 100% renewable by 2030, limiting those existing renewables to 40%, and that gives 60% of our electricity will be coming from new regional and in-state renewables. And this is really what we need to do to drive our regional electricity emissions down and to match the new demand for vehicle electrification and electrification of the thermal sector. Big driver behind this, beyond the climate impacts, is environmental justice. Every kilowatt hour of electricity that comes from wind or solar here in Vermont reduces power generation from fossil fuel plants somewhere in New England. And these plants are disproportionately located in vulnerable communities, such as this peaker plant in Peabody, Mass, that the local utility is looking to expand in a community that's already facing some health disparities. So we expect H320, which would transform the res, to get some real traction and to move. We anticipate that House Energy will be taking, and Environment will be taking that up this month. We're really excited to have so many people supporting this measure, both for the environmental consequences and for the moral imperative there of doing our part on the environmental justice side. The other bill that I wanted to flag for folks is S140, which is a storage bill. This is modeled after legislation that was passed in Maine in 2019. It brings together stakeholders and asks, what's the optimal amount of energy storage we need in Vermont, and how do we get there? It's a 6-month study group that we formed on that with representatives from both sides of the legislature, Vermont's various utilities, and the storage industry. And it's something that can really provide ratepayer cost savings, reliability benefits, and greenhouse gas emission savings. So we're hopeful that that will get some traction as well. I will pass back to you, Lauren.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And we promised you a lot, and we're going to keep going. So I'm just going to briefly give you an overview of a bill H126, which is focused on biodiversity conservation. And of course, conserving biodiversity and a connected landscape is essential to building Vermont's climate resilience, and including things like carbon storage and flood resilience, as we see increased extreme weather. So H126 at its core establishes a target of conserving 30% of Vermont lands and waters by 2030 and 50% by 2050. And this really builds on national efforts. President Biden launched the National America the Beautiful initiative, and the UN COP15 Biodiversity Conference established an international commitment to conserving 30% of lands and waters by 2030. The Vermont Climate Action Plan also recommended that we adopt these targets. So this bill essentially is Vermont doing its part on these international and national commitments. And we know that given current and future development pressures on Vermont's landscape, along with the historic biodiversity loss that's already happened and the ongoing and ramping up impacts of climate change, we really need to be doing a better job of conservation planning. So the bill sets up a process for doing that planning and also inventorying what we have already conserved, so we can get a better understanding of where we are and how we're going to get there. So there's a process set up in the bill where the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board is going to work alongside the Agency of Natural Resources and a whole host of stakeholders like private landowners, land trusts, conservation groups, working land groups, outdoor rec businesses, indigenous groups, and the public in general, with opportunities to weigh in on how do we get to meeting this target of 30% land conservation by 2030. So, at the end of the day, really see this bill as land conservation being a necessary strategy for healthy forests, habitat connectivity, protecting our biodiversity, our outdoor rec industry, our forest industry, public health, and of course, having climate resilient communities. So that bill has passed the House and is now up for action in the Senate. I'm going to now turn it over to Ben Edgerly-Walsh to talk about energy efficiency modernization. And Ben's from VPIRG.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Yeah, Ben Edgerly-Walsh, Climate Program Director at VPIRG. I heard from someone in the chat that audio is a little shaky, so we'll try to speak up. It's coming through clear for me, so to anyone who's having that kind of trouble, maybe try headphones or getting off the speaker. We'll do what we can on our end. Also note, I'm going to drop a couple of things in the chat that provide a little bit more context for some of the conversation that's going on there around the Inflation Reduction Act, and then the VPIRG summary of a lot of this stuff too. So you have this in writing. I know a number of orgs have put that out, so other folks obviously feel free to drop your stuff in there too. So I just wanted to very briefly talk about S137, which is an expansion or an extension rather of a pilot program that was passed in 2020 initially, that provided a little bit of additional flexibility for Efficiency Vermont and Burlington Electric Department, which are Vermont's two electric efficiency utilities, to do more to help Vermonters electrify in the heating and transportation sectors. Traditionally, they've really focused on investments in things like energy efficient refrigerators and light bulbs and all the rest to reduce electric usage. That's very important. They continue to do the vast majority of their work there. This allows them to do a little bit more on electrification because that cuts energy use, even though it increases electric use. So that program was set to run for 3 years. Those 3 years existed entirely during the pandemic. And so they came back and it requested a 3-year extension so they could continue to sort of pilot their work in that sector. This passed the Senate and is on to the House. It's in House Environment and Energy, and we hope they'll take it up after they pass the Affordable Heat Act. One other provision I wanted to note in there is it also allows Burlington Electric Department some additional flexibility to do thermal efficiency in homes served by natural gas, and to provide additional incentives in the transportation space, especially for Burlingtonians who use sort of the top amount of gasoline, use the most gas out of anyone, because if we can better serve those people who have to drive quite a lot for whatever reason in their own life, we are going to get a lot of bang for our buck from a climate standpoint. And there are real equity benefits there as well, because those Vermonters, if they're low income, they're spending up to 30% of their income just on transportation. So getting those folks into electric vehicles is really important and allows BED to do more in that space.
Thank you, Ben. And last update before we turn to a deeper dive into Affordable Heat Act. but really excited to hear from David McColgan of Third Act Vermont to get an update on divestment.
Thanks so much for inviting us to present on the divestment. For those of you who are not familiar with Third Act Vermont, Third Act is a national organization of seniors. You could say it's a new organization for older folks. We're people in the third act of our lives. And the idea, Bill McKibben is one of the founders, the idea is to harness this energy and the time that presumably that we have and our accumulated expertise and wisdom to fight for climate justice and democracy. So that's what we're about. Third Act Vermont has a divestment action team that's been focusing on getting Vermont pension funds divested from the fossil fuel industry. So the bill that we have been working in with senators and representatives in support of is S42, which is a fossil fuel divestment bill seeking to get fossil fuels out of the state pension funds that are under the control of the Vermont Pension Investment Commission, which we call VPIC. So if I refer to VPIC, I'm referring to that pension commission. We had success in the Senate. We've got a veto-proof majority there. They just voted in favor of S42 by a 22-8 vote last Thursday. And it's gone on to the House, where it's starting over again in the Government Operations Committee. The bill is something of a compromise that we negotiated with the treasurer, Mike Pichik, and other members of VPIC, the Pension Commission. We also arranged for testimony from an expert, Tom Sanzillo, from a group called IEFA, which studies energy efficiency and pension issues, and Bill McKibben. The bill calls, first of all, for a study of how much of the pensions are currently invested in fossil fuels, and then for creation of a plan to divest from them. And just to simplify it, it calls for divestment from fossil fuels for all of the pension funds, excluding what's referred to as private investments, and to have that divestment from by 2030. It sets a 2% de minimis exemption. So it calls for divestment with the exception of small amounts that are 2% or less. And regarding private investments, it calls for those to be divested, if possible, if financially prudent, by 2040. And if there's any questions as to why it's different for private investment, I'd be happy to address that during questions and answers. But that's just a brief overview. The bill also gives VPIC a lot of flexibility in implementing this by leaving it up to them to decide what counts as a fossil fuel company, and by requiring that any divestment be consistent with their fiduciary duty to make sure that the funds continue to be earning money at a reasonable rate. Again, thank you for inviting me to address this, and turn it back to you, Lauren.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And I'll put in my chat my email if anybody does have further questions that they'd like to email me about.
That would be great. And thanks for folks chiming in the chat to help get information out. The Inflation Reduction Act rebates and all that funding is going to be such an important part of all of our climate work in the years to come. So as we continue to digest that and understand its implications, we'll keep trying to get good information out to people and build it into our work. All right, so for the second half hour, we're going to dig a little deeper into the Affordable Heat Act, give you an overview and where it stands, and talk some about equity, affordability, and climate accountability. And to kick us off with that is Ben Edgerly-Walsh, again, of VPIRG.
Thanks, Lauren. So I will try to be brief. There's a lot of moving pieces here, and you're going to be hearing from a couple of other folks about a little bit more detail about this year's bill. But I'm going to speak at a high level about the benefits of and need for the Affordable Heat Act, and get into a few key principles that we've had as we've considered this bill. Obviously, I'm speaking for VPIRG here, but I know, having worked very closely with many of the other groups on this call, that others would echo many of the sort of principles that I'm talking about here. So let me just start by saying, in case there was any confusion, we are not remotely on track to hitting our 2030 or 2050 requirements around cutting carbon pollution. We're seeing some modest steps in the right direction, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, reducing the very high energy burden that fossil fuels bring, and reducing our carbon pollution. But absent additional action by the legislature, we're not going to get there. Certainly not in the thermal sector, which is what this bill would cover. So this bill and the policy that it would create, really, from our perspective, is a critical step for the state to take in order to finally get serious about helping Vermonters move away from our dependence on expensive, price volatile fossil fuels for their heating needs, and of course to achieve cuts in carbon pollution required under the Global Warming Solutions Act. The other thing that I wanted to note is, not only are we not going to get there without additional action, without something like this policy, we are also not going to be transitioning in an equitable way, right? Absent additional assistance, folks who have more resources to begin with are more likely to be able to make this transition quickly, and low and moderate income Vermonters with higher energy burdens are less likely to be able to make this transition quickly. So, those are really the two kind of core elements of why we feel like this is so essential. And certainly some pieces of this bill are complex, but at its core, it is actually a very simple idea. There are fossil fuel companies importing fossil fuels into the state in the heating sector. They've been doing that for decades. And just like our electric utilities already do, they should have a responsibility for helping Vermonters in that transition to cleaner, more affordable energy options. And I also want to really stress that this is not a new idea. It would be newly applied in the way that this bill is constructed to these fossil fuel importers, but it's actually a fairly old idea. And in Vermont, for instance, it's been applied in the electric sector for a while now. Vermont's electric utilities already have a legal requirement to help their customers reduce fossil fuel use. So it essentially takes that concept and applies it to fossil fuel importers. So, the other thing I would say, is sort of just to set the table, is, we've got this largely unregulated fossil fuel industry in the heating sector, and absent additional regulations or direction, any industry left to its own devices, they're going to be solving for profit, and they're going to be biased towards the status quo. They're generally speaking going to do what they've always done. Now, these companies are starting to diversify. They're starting to do weatherization, starting to install heat pumps. That's great. But inching forward is not what we need to do. We need to do much better than the status quo. And this policy is a performance standard. It says, here's our requirement. We need to aim at that, and all the activity under this program adds up to those climate pollution reductions, those fossil fuel reductions. So key principles here. One, this policy has to require that we hit our legal targets under the Solutions Act. That is something that it does do. It needs to do that on a life cycle basis, which is to say, it's not enough just to measure the climate pollution that comes when you light a gallon of oil or therm of natural gas on fire in Vermont to heat something. You have to take into account the production of that fuel all the way through the combustion in Vermont. It does that. And the credit that a fossil fuel company gets under this program needs to be directly proportional to the benefit from a climate standpoint that they are actually bringing by helping Vermonters take an action. And again, it does that. So if there's an action that is really only reducing climate pollution a very small amount, that will only get a very small amount of credit. If there's an action that's reducing climate pollution on a life cycle basis really significantly, that'll get a lot more credit under this bill, because in the real world, it's reducing pollution, which is the whole point. It has to do that in a way that drives affordability and equity. You're going to hear more from Dan Fingus from Rights and Democracy in particular on some of the provisions there. It needs to be implementable on the ground. We have a very old housing stock. We have hundreds of thousands of pieces of fossil fuel equipment in basements and utility closets all around the state that generally have years or even decades of life left on them, and we need to take that into account. Those are sunk costs that we are stuck with, whether or not we like it. And to the extent that it allows any quote unquote less bad options, it is really, really important that it has very strong guardrails in place so that those options, while they may be important in the short term to make sure that the program can be equitable and implementable, we do not have an over-reliance on those sorts of options like biofuels, et cetera, and that we are really limiting the program to the better versions of those options. Last thing I want to note is something that has been sort of kicked around in the chat a little bit. There's a lot of other investments happening right now. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dan. We've invested something like $150 million over the last couple of years in programs here in Vermont in low and moderate income weatherization and electrification. Inflation Reduction Act puts another $60 million on the table for that here in Vermont. And we have an incredible opportunity with the tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act that could bring $250 million and more over the next decade into the state if we actually take advantage of that opportunity. But the clock is ticking on those tax credits. They're not going to be available forever. And if we don't actually seize the moment and take this action right now, we are not going to be able to take advantage of those. So this is incredibly important policy. It's well designed. It's not perfect, but it is going to get the ball rolling. And we're strong supporters of it. So happy to answer any questions after I give Dan and Anthony a chance to talk.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so I'm Dan Fingus, Movement Politics Director at Rights and Democracy, and I'm here. I think it's important to kind of set the context really quickly that Rights and Democracy last year was not in favor of the Clean Heat Standard bill as it was put in, and we didn't feel it was focused enough on equity, affordability, and the transition. And we really appreciate the work that's been done since last year to really focus on these things and change the bill in what we think are really big ways. And Ben covered some of the pieces, but I want to I will say we have changed our mind as RAD because of affordability, equity, the transition, and also life cycle accounting from feedstock to emissions. I'm going to focus on affordability and equity and let Anthony focus on the other two things. I think the biggest thing that changed with affordability really is actually really naming and prioritizing the mitigation efforts. So that's your weatherization, your heat pumps, and other things that are going to make your house or where you live more, or where you work, more energy efficient and use less energy. That's where everyone's going to see affordability and cost savings, and making sure that that is really prioritized in this bill, which it is. One of the ways it's prioritized in this bill is that 16% of retired credits need to be for low income Vermonters, 16% need to be for moderate income Vermonters. And so that 32% in actuality, because low and moderate income Vermonters is only in the residential sector, actually makes up about 60 to 64% of the residential sector. And so it's going to be a huge amount of the credits in the residential sector are going to low and moderate income Vermonters. And it's also going to ensure that 50% of those credits are for mitigation. And so half of the work at least needs to be for mitigation. And I think that's really, really important. And I think throughout the bill, there is reference to low and moderate income Vermonters. There's a lot of talk in a lot of different sections of the bill, ensuring that all the programs that are created actually help them. I think that's a big important thing around equity as well. I'm not a big fan of quoting bills, but I'm probably going to do it twice here, just because I think it's important to read the words that are actually in the bill. And so this piece is from the kind of the start of the bill and really the intention of the bill. The Clean Heat Standard shall be designed and implemented to enhance social equity by prioritizing customers with low income, moderate income, those households with the highest energy burdens, and renter households with tenant-paid energy bills. The design shall ensure all customers have an equitable opportunity to participate in and benefit from clean heat measures, regardless of heating fuel used, income level, geographic location, residential building type, or home ownership status. I think that's really important. It was a really level setting within the bill that's really crucial, and you see it throughout the bill. I think another piece that's really important is there's an equity advisory group whose job it is to actually make sure that the implementation and creation of the Clean Heat Standard is done in an equitable way. And we've done some good work to ensure that there is actually renters involved with that, and there's other social economic classes that are involved in that. And that's really important to make sure we have the right people in the room reviewing the policy and giving the advice on how to make it the most equitable. The last piece from RAD's perspective is we do a lot of work with renters. We do a lot of housing work, and it really specifies ensuring that renters are treated equitably within the program. Specifically that they shall create specific programs for multi-unit dwellings, condo associations, renters, and for manufactured homes, so that these groups have equal opportunity to benefit from the Clean Heat Standard. I think in our current system, so much of the benefit is to the wealthy and to folks that are homeowners, and we have to really balance those scales. And I think these are really important things. And with that said, I will turn it over to Anthony to talk about some other pieces of the bill.
Thanks so much, Dan and everybody. I just want to say, before I get into the specific details, I'm very happy to be representing Conservation Law Foundation as part of this Act on Climate Coalition. And one thing that we've been hearing from the administration, which folks will remember vetoed the Global Warming Solutions Act from the get-go, is that we need to slow down, that we're rushing, and that the deadlines set in the Global Warming Solutions Act are really self-imposed and arbitrary. And I just want to remind everybody, I know everyone on this call doesn't need a reminder, but when you're talking to your neighbors, and you're talking to your friends, when you're talking to your legislators, we just got some really bad news from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, about the urgency of addressing climate change. The bad news was we have less time than we thought. Even the Global Warming Solutions Act, we're looking at 2050 for our most dramatic cuts. And what we're hearing from the scientists is the mid to late 2030s is the time scale we're on. So we don't have time to waste. And the good news is we do have tools to make those reductions. And it's exciting to be on this call and to hear about the range of measures that we here in Vermont are pushing forward to make sure that we do our fair share. We've been able at the Conservation Law Foundation, like Rights and Democracy, to come on board and support S5, the Affordable Heat Act, because there have been some really positive changes since the Clean Heat Standard was considered in the last biennium. And fundamentally, that means that the act is reducing our reliance on and accurately accounting for biofuels in the bill. We know that incentivizing a switch away from fossil fuels will only result in progress toward our pollution reduction obligations if the heat sources we switch to are truly less polluting. And in the long run, burning biofuels will not help us slow climate change. But for this reason, CLF is strongly supporting provisions in the Affordable Heat Act that will, over time, dramatically weed out all but the very cleanest biofuels. For example, those made from methane that would otherwise have been released without mitigation into the atmosphere. The new bill's declining cap on the carbon intensity of biofuels eligible for clean heat credits is a central reason why CLF is now able to support the Affordable Heat Act. And just to give you a sense of what this terminology means, what the bill does is it looks at the status quo. What's our worst case scenario? Our worst case scenario is burning #2 fuel oil. We know that that is our most polluting, from a climate perspective, source of fuel. So if we're going to switch away from the worst case scenario, let's make sure the things that we're switching to really are an improvement. And what the bill does is, on a life cycle basis, not just when the fuel is burned, but when it's produced, how it's produced, how it is transported, looking at all of those things on a life cycle basis, the bill requires that the Public Utility Commission reduce over time the eligibility of biofuels for clean heat credits based on their carbon intensity. So essentially, how do they compare to number 2 fuel oil? If number 2 fuel oil is 100 and 100 is the worst we can do, then how do we ratchet down over time, looking again at all those factors that contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions of a fuel source over its lifetime? And what the bill does is to tell the Public Utility Commission that you've got to ratchet down so that any biofuel, in order to continue to be eligible for clean heat credits, must be 80% or less carbon intensive than number 2 fuel oil by 2025. Then by 2030, 60% or less. So again, a 40% reduction in the carbon pollution all in on a life cycle basis by 2030. And by 2050, all the way down to 20% or less pollution, carbon intensive pollution from a life cycle basis as measured against the number 2 fuel oil and the status quo. And when we look at this life cycle basis, the legislation specifically requires that the PUC address issues like fugitive emissions from methane transport, leaky pipelines, for example. It also requires the PUC to look at the loss of stored carbon. For example, if we're converting forest for advanced wood heat, or otherwise burning wood to heat our homes and our businesses, we've got to look at that loss of carbon when we factor in the carbon intensity of biogenic fuel sources. In addition, there is another level of safeguard, and that has to do with the requirement that the PUC every 2 years assess the harmful consequences, not just in Vermont, but elsewhere, of implementation of the clean heat, to the extent it's driving deforestation, to the extent that it's driving conversion of grasslands to grow crops like ethanol from corn or soybean, damage to watersheds, and also particularly to avoid the creation of new methane to meet fuel demand. Yes, it's true that we are in Vermont, we have some dairy farms that are contributing to our energy supply through cow power, and maybe they might switch over and supply some of their methane for heating purposes. But we want to make sure that we're not essentially driving a cash cow, pardon the pun, so that we're essentially having people adding dairy cows to farms, not because they're helping to feed our population, but because they're attempting to create new methane for the purposes of gaming the clean heat system. So when you look at these safeguards that have been added to the bill since last year, and they are substantial and significant, what you see is we're going to have a much more accurate picture of how biofuels and different biofuels will have different characteristics and different problems and benefits associated with them. So how we can ratchet those down over time to make sure that the implementation of a clean heat standard truly results in the reductions we need to satisfy not just the legal requirements in the Global Warming Solutions Act, but to make sure that Vermont is doing our fair share to avoid catastrophic climate change and to stabilize our climate so that we can save life as we know it on Earth. And so it's for these reasons, as well as the reasons that Dan mentioned regarding enhancements to equity, that Conservation Law Foundation is proud to stand with this coalition to support S5 largely as it passed the Senate. And we will be watching closely for any amendments in the House that would weaken the bill and lead to our withdrawal of support. But this and the emphasis on cleaner measures like heat pumps, which we want to make sure, as Jonathan Dowd was saying from Renewable Energy Vermont, that our electrical grid is as clean as it can be, so that we're saving emissions there. But these are the reasons why CLF thinks that the Affordable Heat Act is an important step onward and upward in our fight to save a stable climate. So with that, I'm not sure who I'm supposed to pass back to.
I can pick it up from here. We've been collecting lots of questions and want to try to get to, we've got a few minutes left before we wrap at 1. So we should be able to get to some of them. I know there's been some kind of conversation in the chat. So some things have been answered a little bit. Like for quickly, somebody had asked about the bottle bill. And of course, plastics is another place where fossil fuels are being used, and the fossil fuel industry is seeing a shift to plastics as a big way to continue having a market for their products as we transition to clean energy. So I think we should all be paying attention to that as well. And a bill to expand and modernize the bottle bill did pass the Vermont House on a really strong vote and is up for action in the Senate Natural Resources Committee. Anyone who wants to reach out and encourage those committee members to take up and move that bill, I think that is great, great progress as well. One question we definitely wanted to get to, Laurel had asked about the cost impacts and, lifting up that people are just concerned about, what is this going to cost everyday people? And so I just wanted somebody to speak to, how are we going to be able to assess the impact of costs and kind of timing were the two pieces that Laurel had asked about. So I don't know who wants to take that one on. Raise your hand, jump in.
I can certainly take a crack at it. So one, I just want to be very, very clear, and I hope everyone on this call understands this, but just in case, this is not a tax, and it would be implemented in 2026 after legislative approval in 2025. Essentially, the legislature would need to pass another bill approving, potentially with modifications, the rules that state regulators bring forward in 2025 before it could be implemented starting in 2026. So one, the cost allegations that have been put out there are inaccurate. Two, it does not go into effect until 2026. And then three, to the question on like, when are we going to know more? That's a very fair question. The reality of a program like this is you actually need to get further into the program design before you actually have your hands fully wrapped around that kind of a question. Even then, no one has a crystal ball. But there's a couple of really important provisions in the bill that are going to give us a lot more clarity before that 2025 vote. One, in 2024 and then again in 2025, this PUC, those are the state regulators tasked with implementing this bill, are required to bring forward a pretty thorough report on their work, on what the program will look like, and on the costs, benefits, et cetera, of implementing the program. So there will be two very thorough reports, the second one coming in January 2025. The other thing that's required is the Department of Public Service needs to do what's called a potential study. This is already done for, Efficiency Vermont's work, for instance. They do one every few years to sort of true up what they're trying to do with what the market what's out there in the market, what's the workforce, what do the supply chains look like, all the other things that go into this transition. So the Department of Public Service is going to be required to do a very thorough assessment of what the market could bear, or what the market can potentially do, and what could be achieved through this and other programs already in effect, and what the cost of that's going to be. And so that will also be done well in advance of that vote in 2025. Anthony, do you want to jump in on this? I also wanted to tackle one other thing, but go ahead.
No, go for it, Ben. I'll see if you say it, and then I might not have.
Well, I was going to shift to another question. So if it's on this, please go for it.
Well, yeah, I just want people to keep in mind that, the price of fuel oil has gone up more than 100% in the last couple of years, and that has had nothing to do and provided no benefits to Vermont in terms of climate reductions and cost savings. That's just about the record profits that the fossil fuel companies have reaped. And we see in the newspaper yesterday that Saudi Arabia is talking about cutting production to keep the cost of oil high. So one of the things to keep in mind when you're talking to neighbors who are concerned about cost is that the Affordable Heat Act is about giving people other options to save costs in the long term, to get us off the price roller coaster, to stop padding the profits of the fossil fuel industry, and to keep more of our heating dollars at home here in Vermont, employing our neighbors in the struggle to save our climate and our way of life. So that's an important factor in the cost conversation that needs to be brought forward anytime it comes up.
Here. Let me just say a word on the life cycle assessment, because I think there's been some confusion in the chat about that. The life cycle assessment that's required by this bill is required of all fuels that could potentially be used under this: biomass, biofuels, RNG, hydrogen, and the fossil fuels that they're replacing. So there are no exemptions to that. I don't know where anyone's getting that idea, but that is absolutely not accurate. And the bill is very, very clear that that life cycle assessment is universal. And I also, want to just emphasize what you've already heard. This is a very strong version of language around what is required in a life cycle assessment. Fugitive methane is explicitly called out as something that needs to be taken into account. Loss of stored carbon, when you're talking about something like biomass, that is a critical issue to look at. That is explicitly named in the bill in black and white. So that is absolutely something that applies across the board, and is a big reason why we can support that life cycle assessment, because it is clear, strong, and transparent. I also have a little bit of information. I don't know, Dan, do you want to talk about the renters piece? I can also just drop something on the chat. I know we're running out of time.
I mean, I think I covered most of the pieces. I think, Ben, you have some specific language that you could cut and paste and put in there. But I think, renters are lifted up throughout the bill, and specifically making sure they're in part of the programs that are being created, and especially the weatherization programs and those mitigation programs. So those are the really crucial parts for renters. In the status quo, it's really hard for renters to get weatherization. What's happening right now is renters are almost shut out of the ability, if their landlords don't want to do the weatherization. And so renters are paying the utility costs a lot of the time, but they don't have the ability to make their homes more comfortable from weatherization, but also more fuel efficient and able to save money. So this is really important that these programs are created, and that the funding from the wholesalers, the money that that's going to be generated through the credits, are actually, the money that's going to be generated because people need the credits, is going to go towards these programs. And so it's really fuel wholesalers paying for low and moderate income weatherization, heat pumps, and other measures. And that's exactly the model we want to see.
Thank you for that. It is 1 o'clock. Does someone have a relatively quick answer to the grid question somebody had posted a minute ago? What's the status quo capacity of the grid? Are we going to be able to handle if we electrify a ton of things and heating? I don't know, Jonathan, if you've got thoughts, or somebody else wants to. Joey, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, I'll chime in. Vermont's grid, like the grid across the country, definitely is going to need modernization and upgrades in the face of a big move to electrification. In the long run, having a more robust grid is going to provide resilience benefits. It can facilitate the movement of renewables from one part of the state to another, or one part of the country to another. So there are some real cost and resiliency benefits to that as well, but it is an area where we will have to be spending money to make the grid robust enough to handle the deep electrification and deep decarbonization that we're talking about. I will add that in the face of increased rain, storms, other natural disasters, if we are not making big investments in the grid, we are simply going to be plowing more money into repairing grid failures. So as with much of the climate agenda, these are investments that pay off in the long term. And it's not like, if we don't spend this money, we're not spending any money and we can use it on other things. It's if we don't spend this money on mitigation, we're spending it on adaptation and repair. So again, it is an area that needs investment, but it's well worth investing in.
Great. Well, it's 1:01, so I want to wrap us up, but I'm so grateful for all of you for joining us, giving us your lunch hour and sitting through a lot of information. We are recording this, so if you want to go back later, if there was a piece you missed and were interested in, feel free to do that. Please continue to make your voice heard. These issues are so important, and a lot of people are weighing in at the State House, and taking the time to make your voice heard is really critical. And just thanks for all the speakers for sharing such really helpful information. And you can reach all of us and keep in touch, and keep raising your questions and your voices. So take care, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and we hope to see you soon.